So this week Parsha is Parshas Eikev. And the first pasuk in this week's Parsha is Eikev Tishmon Esa Mishpotum Oela V'Shamartem V'Asisa Moisam V'Shamar Hashem Elokecha L'Chos HaBris V'Sachesed Asher Nishba Le'avoisecha. And Rashi says Eikev Tishmon Mitzvos Kalis She'odem Dosh Ba'akevov. But the Sechar, the reward that HaKadosh Baruch Hu promises in these psukim is immense, is huge. So how would we understand, what is the logic that the mitzvahs kalas have the greatest reward? V'shamar Hashem Elokecha, and that is obviously midah keneged midah. Ushamartem v'asisem oisam. So many of the early commentators on the Torah say Ushamartem v'asisem oisam. Ushamartem is maloshen va'ovav shamar es adover. You will anticipate and prepare and cherish and invest in the hachana to these mitzvahs. So the mitzvahs kalas are the mitzvahs that are part of our routine. And it is those mitzvahs that really make the difference between an oived elokim la'asher loi avodoi. And what defines a human being and his character and his closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu are not the great mitzvahs that we have once in a lifetime or once a year, but mitzvahs of routine, the way we daven, and the way we say Kriya Shema, and the way we say Berachas Anan, because we're saying brachos all day. Every cup of water you say a bracha. Those are the mitzvahs kalash odem dash ba'akevov. The expression odem dash ba'akevov means the mitzvahs you perform along the way. Those are the mitzvahs that are part of our daily routine, and they really make the difference more than any others. So the challenge with these mitzvahs is vishamartem v'asisa moisam, to look forward to these mitzvahs, to invest your passion and your feelings and your emotion in these mitzvahs that are part of your routine, and that is ultimately what makes you an oived elokim. And that is what I wrote briefly in Minhag Shichos al Torah on this very same pasuk. So today we will be discussing a fascinating topic. Looking around, well, I don't know whether most of you are Hasidim or not Hasidim, but many Hasidim for the past 250 years is when we perform various different mitzvahs, whether it's mitzvah shebedibo or mitzvah shebamaisa. Hasidim usually say, and that was a big controversy. And that is what we will be discussing today. So the Chai Odom has a fascinating klal samaches. And klal samaches, the Chai Odom brought together from all the Shas and all the Shulchan Aruch the basic concepts in Kiyum HaMitzvahs, mitzvahs asay. Kolorei hazehirus b'mitzvahs. And he brings together and discusses many different concepts. So these are Magdim ala mitzvahs. Mitzvah bolayat wal tachmitzena. Oisig b'mitzvah potam en mitzvah. Mitzvah sichas kavona. And many other concepts like Berav Am Hadras Melech and Hidu Mitzvah. And the very last sif in Klal Samaches is Shoyma Mitzvah Lo Yeda Davaro. And he gives a very startling or surprising interpretation. Basically, most other commentators say Shoyma Mitzvah, a person that observes the mitzvahs Lo Yeda Davaro, which means, like the Gemara says in Soite Chof Aleph, Torah and mitzvahs agune magne umetzule matzli. When you perform mitzvahs, they give you shmira, but the Chai Odom has a different interpretation, and he says shoyme mitzvah is maloshen va'ovav shomer as a davar. If you look forward to mitzvahs, if you cherish your mitzvahs, and you prepare, you invest in the preparation to the performance of mitzvahs. That is what the pasuk says lo yeda davaro. And he gives another big chiddush, and he says, why do we find dafka by the mitzvahs of Chag Pesach, v'shamartem es hamatzos, and Rashi brings the Mechilta al tikra matzos el mitzvahs, v'shamartem es hamitzvahs, mitzvah boliyot wal tachmitzana, because Pesach is mechal b'chipozon, and if we need to eat korban Pesach b'chipozon, we might not invest enough in the achana to the mitzvah. And that is why the Torah says, Dafkin the mitzvahs of Pesach, Ushamartim es amatzos. Once again, your interpretation of Chai Yodam is Ushamartim, Meloshin, Ovev Shomasador. And that is why the minhag is to say before every mitzvah, Hineni, Michon, Mezomen, Lakayim, mitzvah say. So, it's a chiddush that the Chai Yodam, who was a Mechutna of the Gra, a tremendous admirer of the Gra, he wasn't the Talmud of the Goen, but he was a Mechutna and a great admirer, and he says, that is the reason we say, Hineni, Michon, Mezomen. And then he writes that I could testify from my personal life, whenever I'm Mekayim a mitzvah without proper preparation, I am not Mekayim the mitzvah kera'ui. So he emphasizes how important it is achona l'dvar mitzvah. So, the Noida Yehuda, going back more than 200 years, Madura Kami Yoredeasim in Tzadik Gimel. Somebody asked the Noida Yehuda, what is the pshat in the tefillah that we say, L'shem Yichud Kudish Obarich Yeshchimta L'yachad Shem Yud Kei Bavavkei? Could he explain what this means? And the Noida Yehuda has quite an angry tshuva. And he writes, instead of asking me to tell you pshat and L'shem Yichud, why don't you ask me whether it is appropriate at all to say it? And I think it's an awful mistake. That's what the Noida Yehuda writes. And he says, previous generations knew that Yiddishkeit is about the Bavli and the Yerushalmi and the Shulchan Aruch and Digduk Adin and Kiyum HaMitzvos v'Purtei v'Digdukein, and they were far better than we are. And we live in a generation in which Kol Echad Oimer Unoichi Haroya V'li Niftahu Shara Shemayim. Everybody is a Makubal and everybody sees what's happening in the heavens. V'Koira Ani Aleihem Yishoram Darki Hashem, Tzadikim Yelchu Bam, V'Chasidim Yekoshlu Bam. So the Noida Yehuda paraphrases this posuk. Instead of Rashoram Yekoshlu Bam, he writes, Yishoram Darki Hashem, Tzadikim Yelchu Bam, V'Chasidim Yekoshlu Bam. And I heard from my great Rebbe, from the Kloisenberg Rebbe, many times, that an article of the Noida Yehuda, when they reprinted the monumental work, the Noida Yehuda, and an article came to the Divrei Chaim, to the Tzan Zarov, and he said, maybe time has come after 150 years to fix, the lashon of the posek, and maybe we should write tzadikim yelchu bam v'rasham yikoshlu bam, like it's in Tanakh. And the Divrei Chaim scorned him, and he said, "You're a zaydim, turn the Rishonim into Chasidim, and you want to make Chasidim into Rishonim?" He says, "No way. Leave it as it is. Leave l'shayin kadshay of the Noida Yehuda." So that's the Noida Yehuda. And one of the great Hasidic masters, Hasidic Rabbeim, Ben Doiroi Shel Noida Yehuda, a contemporary of the Noida Yehuda, was the Be'er Mayim Chaim. And the Be'er Mayim Chaim wrote 3 unbelievable svarim. One is Be'er Mayim Chaim al Torah, and the other is Sidurei Shel Shabbos, and Parshas Shabbos, and Avodas Shabbos, and Sefer number 3 is Sharat Tefillah, and Avodas Tefillah. And the Sefer Sharat Tefillah, at the beginning of the Sefer, he printed a lengthy tshuva which rejects the arguments of the Noida Yehuda, and he substantiates the Minhag of saying L'shem Yichud. So, first, a very brief historical overview about L'shem Yichud, because many people think that the Hasidim were the ones that formulated this nusach, and they were the ones that suggested that we should say L'shem Yichud. And this was one of the focal points in the machlokes between Hasidim and Misnagdim. Velohi. Historically, that is not right. The early sources of L'shem Yichud, first of all, are in Kisvei Ha'ari, and that is in Shar Ruach HaKodesh Perek Yud, in Shar HaKavonos of Derya Kodesh. Number 2, Reishis Chochma, who was a Ben Doiroi almost of the Ari, Rabbi Yodi Vidash, in Reishis Chochma Shar or Ahava. And number 3 is the Shlo Mesachet Yuma. And in these 3 sources we find that Chasidim Yan Shemaisa, before performing a mitzvah, should say Hineni Mechanim Zumin and L'shem Yichud. It is based on the Zohar in Parshas Tazria. So the Zohar does not give us the formula of L'shem Yichud, but what do we find in Zohar? The Zohar says that B'Tzalel and the Jews of the generation of Akomas Mishkan, everything they did, they said, they verbalized, Hotziu b'fiem, hineni boine l'shem shumayim l'shem kedushas Hashem l'shem beis hamidosh. And the Zohar says when a person builds a house, and he's speaking about every house. You buy a house, you buy an apartment. One should say with his mouth, he should verbalize, I am building this house, la'avodas Hashem. And everything that one does, all the ma'asim tovim he does, he should say and verbalize, not only think in his heart, that he's doing it l'shem shemayim. So that is all we find in Zohar, but based on the Zohar, Gedolah Mekabolim, going back 500 years, were the first that suggested l'shem yichud. And those that rejected l'shem yichud also were more than 100 years before the Baal Shem Tov. Chuvas Shiur. Shiur is a monumental sefer. I'm a tremendous admirer of the Shiur. It's the Gedolah Poskim, slightly younger than the Magen Avraham. It goes back almost 400 years. And the Shiur Semerei Yichud has a very, very interesting tshuva about Limud HaKabbalah. And he writes that somebody asked him to be mefarish, to explain the same question that was posed to the Noida Yehuda. Somebody asked him to explain, what does it mean? Liyachad shmei dekudush ubarichi v'shchinte liyachad shem yudkei b'vovkei. And the Shiur writes, I didn't give him an answer, and he was angry. Why am I not responding? And the Shiur says, how could I explain what I don't understand myself? I have no idea what we're saying. I have no idea what it means. So I can't explain to others what I myself don't understand. And the Shiur rejects this meaning. Chok Yankov is the Shvus Yankov, ben doire shel Shiur, more than 100 years before the Baal Shem Tov. Chok Yankov in Hilchas Sfiras U'Omer, Sementov Peites Shulchan Aruch HaChaim. It's interesting, because in all the Sidurim, even the Ashkenaz Sidurim, by Sfiras U'Omer, they all become Chasidim. Interesting. And I think even the Ashkenaz Sidurim, by Sfiras U'Omer, they have Hinenim V'Chanam Zum and Akayim and Rabbeinu Shaloilom, the Takan Masha Bekamti B'Sviro, and they have all the Sheva Sfiras. And the Chok Yankov writes that recently I have seen new Sidurim, and they have all kind of strange Tfilas that we never heard of before. And the Chok Yankov and the Shiur reject the Minhag of the Shem Yichud and all those special Tfilas. So this was a matter of dispute going back more than 100 years before the Baal Shem Tov. So why is it commonly thought to be a machlokes between Chasidim and Misnagdim? Because we do see from the tshuva of the Noida Yehuda that Chasidim, as in many other areas, there were always mikabolim. But until the Baal Shem Tov and his Talmidim came along, it was b'tzina, and it was on an individual basis. There were those Yechidim that dedicated days and nights and their lives to learn Torah Kabbalah, and they davened b'nusach ha'ari, but it was always b'tzina in a very discreet and private way. But Chasidim en masse accepted nusach ha'ari, nusach sfarid, and they based their minhagim in a very high profile of Torah Kabbalah. And that is why the Noida Yehuda was disturbed in his days about l'shem yichud. Not that it was a new tefillah. The Noida Yehuda even deals in that same tshuva with the question, how do we say liyachad shem yud kei b'vav kei? Do we pronounce the hey, or we say yud kei? And the Noida Yehuda writes, I remember as a youngster, those people that said l'shem yichud did pronounce the hey, and they say yud hey and vav hey. So obviously the Noida Yehuda, as a young boy, I don't know how old he was, he learned that the brother Klois, and the brother Klois were misnagdim. And he did hear, he testifies as a youngster, the people that said l'shem yichud, how they pronounced the shem. So this goes back, way back. A Talmud of the Noida Yehuda was Reb Loza Fleckels. He actually was a Talmud of the Tumim, but he was a chaver in the basin of the Noida Yehuda. And many places in his Shuvas he writes, Moiri v'Ravi, Rabbeinu Agodol. So even though the Noida Yehuda was far younger than the Rabbi Yonis and Eibish's, he also saw himself as a Talmud of the Noida Yehuda. And there are two very interesting tshuvas in his sefer. Tshuva mi'ahava, Shalos Tshuvas, Siman Aleph, Chelek Aleph, Siman Aleph. He writes, I was present, first day of Sukkot, when many people stood in line to say the brocha on the esrog of the Rav, on the Noida B'Yehuda's esrog. I thought it's a minhag only by Rebbes. And in my shul, many people come to take my esrog. I thought I'm a Rebbe. But Tshuva Mi'ahava writes that the same was with the Noida B'Yehuda. Obviously he wasn't a Rebbe because he was a Misnagid. So people approached and stood in line to take the esrog of the Noida B'Yehuda, and then one person stood there and he started saying L'Shem Yichud, and the Noida B'Yehuda threw him out, and he said, somebody that says L'Shem Yichud will not say a broch on my esrog, and he didn't give him his esrog. That is a story that Beloza Flechels testifies to in Chelek Aleph Siman Aleph and Shalos Tshuvas Tshuva Mi'ahava. And in Siman Tzadik, once again, he deals with the question of L'Shem Yichud, and that is a very interesting tshuva. It is interesting on many counts. He writes, Zeh kuf nun shonim shenahagu loyma L'Shem Yichud, 150 years, and he was a contemporary of the Noida B'Yehuda. So once again, that goes back 100 years before the Baal Shem Tov. And he says, Zeh kuf nun shonim shenahagu loyma L'Shem Yichud. My Rebbe, the Noida B'Yehuda, was against it, but he wasn't the moiche b'Rabbi. So he was aware that many people in the community do say it. He was against it, but he was never moiche b'Rabbim, which is a Toras Chaim. You may have your own opinions, but not always do you have to come out against things. So that is the second tshuva that the Tshuva Mi'ahava writes about the minhag of L'Shem Yichud. So historically, it's not about Chassidim and Misnagdim, but it came up again in the time of the Noida B'Yehuda when Chassidim, in a very high-profile way and a very public way, all of them, en masse, used to say L'Shem Yichud. So I'm a Talmud of the Kloisenberg Rebbe, who was actually the greatest mamshech of the Divrei Chaim. He was an Einikel of the sons of Rav. And the Kloisenberg Rebbe, he also writes it in his Tshuvas Divrei Yatzav, Chelek Aleph Orochaim Semesamachei. He writes, I heard from my father, Rudnik Harav, who was an Einikel, a direct Einikel of the Divrei Chaim, and I heard from my father that the Divrei Chaim said, Reb Chaskele was right. Reb Chaskele is gewen gerecht. And he means the Noida B'Yehuda. And the Divrei Chaim was against L'Shem Yichud. And in Sons, they did not say L'Shem Yichud only once a year. B'leila Seder. And I don't know why. And the Kloisenberg Rebbe doesn't explain why the Seder night would be different. But it's a very interesting... What? He doesn't say. But obviously, Sipi Yetzias Mitzrayim, Matzah, and Morah, I guess. But what is interesting to note is that a Mishnah Brura, only once, does he write, Yesh, Noyagam Loimer Hineni Mukhar Mizumin, and that is Tufan Gimel in Sivkot Nalef, the beginning of Tufan Gimel, Beleila Sera. He doesn't mention it by Tzitzis, he doesn't mention it by Tefillin, he doesn't mention it before Baruch Shomar, and in all the Sidurim we have, Hareinim Ezamin Espila Hoidis Olahalam, the Mishnah Brura doesn't bring it anywhere, only in Tufan Gimel Beleila Seder. And it coincides with what the Kloisenberg Rebbe said in the name of the Divrei Chaim. In Sons, they said it only Beleila Seder. Well, regarding the Mishnah Brura, I must say, my basic feeling was, in Litta, nobody said it. And in the Ashkenaz Sidurim, it didn't appear. But in the Haggadahs, the Mishnah Brura saw it. So, Beleila Seder, he writes, Yesh Noyagim Loimer, because he saw it in the Haggadahs. He didn't see it in the Sidurim. So I don't think the Mishnah Brura has a special kavona why Dafka Beleila Seder. He neither recommends it Beleila Seder. He writes Yesh Noyagim. So I think the Mishnah Brura saw it in the Haggadahs. He didn't see it in the Sidurim because in the Litta it wasn't in the Sidurim. Anyway,
one issue
that's a very good question. Definitely two different issues. Because the Chai Adam doesn't mention L'Shem Yichud. All he says is, Hineni Mukhar Mizumin, and that is part of the preparation to the mitzvah. The Noida B'Yehuda, in that very same tshuva in which he adamantly and angrily rejects L'Shem Yichud, he writes, any mitzvah that has a bracha, there is no need to say anything. because the bracha is the achona to the mitzvah. But those mitzvahs in which we do not have a bracha, ani noyeg loimer hineni yoisedov azel l'shem mitzvah. So the Noida Yehuda rejects l'shem Yichud, and he does accept and recommend, and it was his own minhag to say hineni michan umezuman. So they're not the same. So after this brief overview, historical overview, let's deal a bit with the lamdas. What is the question? So the Noida Yehuda has two tshuvas. Oire Chaim, Chelik Beisim and Kuv Zayin is very short. But the more substantial one is also very short, and that is Yoredea Medura Kamasim and Tzadi Gimel. So the one that turned to the Noida Yehuda with the Shaila made two arguments. By get, we find that one needs to write a get lishma. And the Shulchan Aruch says in Even Ezer Kuf Lamed Aleph that the Sofer needs to say and verbalize Ani koisav get ze lishma. So the same would be regarding Kiyum HaMitzvos. I don't know why the Shoyal had to go all the way to Even Ezer Kuf Lamed Aleph. And why not Hilchos Tzitzis, first Siman Siman Yud Aleph? The Mechaber says Tzorach Sheyoyma. And twice in Hilchos Tefillin, Siman Lamed Beis Sif Ches regarding Ibud HaKlaf, Sif Yud Tes regarding Ksivas HaTefillin, and Ksivas HaAskoros, and Yoredeya, Reish Ayin Aleph and Reish Ayin Daled, Ibud HaKlaf and Ksivas Sefer Torah. So Even Ezer is the last source. DNA get, we have the same in three different sources in Shulchan Aruch HaChaim, two sources in Yoredeya. So the Noida Yehuda rejects that argument, and he says, to the contrary, in Zvocham Dav Beis and Beis, the Gemara says, regarding Kochim Stoma Lishma. So why regarding a get we don't say Stoma Lishma? Why does the Sofer need to have clear kavona that he writes Lishma? Stam ish ulav legeru shenoy medes. Stam kor moimed lakrova. Chatas l'shem chatas, oile l'shem oile, shlomim l'shem shlomim. So the Noida Yehuda writes, Mitzvos shelanu kodshim heim v'stomim lishman. So you don't need to say anything. And that is an argument which the Hayom Chaim pounced upon and totally rejected. And Lachoyri is right. How could you say mitzvah stomem lishman? The halacha is mitzvah sichas kavana. By kodshim you do not need a kavana. There is only psul machshava if you add an improper kavana. But stomem lishman. But we don't say by mitzvah stomem lishman. Sometimes you respond to an argument that another party makes and you come to regret it. Because the truth is, it has no kesher whatsoever. But the Noida Yehuda wanted to be doiche from that very same source. But there was no need. So, in three different areas, we find in the Rishonim major discussions. When we have a gather of kavona, does kavona mean machshavas alev, or do you need to verbalize? Does kavona mean dibur, or dai b'machshavas alev? Pigul and other machshavas psul bekodshim. So Toises Bava Metzia Mem Gimel Amid Beis Psochim Dalad Amid Beis Lo Psochim, not Psochim Psochim Samach Gimel Zvochim Dav Dalad Amid Beis. Toises various sources of Shas brings in the name of Dari. There is no pigel, only befeh, not believe. Rashi Kiddushin Mem Beis Amid Beis makes it clear. Pigel is either befeh or b'machshavas alev. So this is a machlokes that Rishonim and the Mishnah Melech deals with it at great length. One source. Source number two, lishma. Whenever we need lishma. And I mentioned many sources. Tzitzis, Siman Yud Aleph, Tefillin, Siman Lamed Beis, Sefer Torah, Yoredei, Reish Ayin Aleph, Reish Ayin Daled. In all these various sources, the B'Sheisa brings machlokes Rishonim. Lishma is machshavas alev sufficient, or you need to verbalize and say that you do English Shema. That's number 2. Where's number 3? It's not halacha l'maisa, and it takes us to Choshen Mishpat. So we dealt with Orach Chaim, we dealt with Yeridei, we dealt with Ebenezer. How does it come into Choshen Mishpat? The din of Shlichus Yad. A shomer that bears responsibility to look after a pekodin. There's a concept of Shlichus Yad. If he did not fulfill his duty, and he partook of the pekodin tachas yodai, then he bears responsibility. Dinoi kiganev. And Beis Shammai says even hachoyshev l'shloyach yad bepekodin is chayev. And there's a machlokes in the Rishonim. Hachoyshev does not mean a person is mischayev b'machshavas alev, or only if he said that. So in these 3 areas, we find that sometimes machshava necessitates dibur. And the question is, by mitzvahs. Mitzvahs sichas kavana. Is there a need for dibur? To me, milsa de pshita. No. How do I know? Because nobody says that. From the Gemara, Rosh Hashanah Chav Ches, and many different sources in Shas, none of the Rishonim, the only major akron that says mitzvah sichas kavana, maybe we need dibur, is the Minchas Chinuch, Sof Mitzvah Yud. And to me, Teime Gedoyl ala Minchas Chinuch. Poshet sheba mitzvah sichas kavana, there's no need for dibur. How do I know? By the mere fact that nobody says it. Well, by Shlichus Yad it's a machlokes in Rishonim. By Lishma it's a machlokes in Rishonim. By Pigel it's a machlokes Rashi and Tosfos. Nobody says mitzvah sichas kavana that you need dibur. Why would there be a difference? 2 different ways to explain. There's a different concept in Shas. Dvorim shebelev einam devorim. So Dvorim shebelev einam devorim refers only to halachas that are not between a person and a Kodesh Baruch Hu, but between one another's. By kinyonim, by kedushin, by gerushin. It's not only between you and a Kodesh Baruch Hu. It's between you and him and you and her, and this is a din which affects others. It's not personal, only between you and Hashem. That is where we say Devorim shebelev einam devorim. Because what you think in your heart cannot dictate halachas that are relevant to others as well. And that is a very fundamental understanding. So, Shlichus Yad is between the shomer and the mafkid. So, he cannot be chayev on machshavas alev. Pigul affects not only the kohen that passes the korban, it affects the bailim. It affects other karhanim that are part of the avodah. And if it's a korban posel, that has different halachas than a korban kosher. Yetzel beis asreif, there is no haktoras eimer, so it affects others. Lishma affects others. Whether the tzitzis are kosher tzitzis, whether the tefillins are kosher tefillin, whether the sefer Torah is kosher, so it affects others. So, by these halachas, yesh oimen that you need diva. Whether a person performs a mitzvah, whether he's yoytzer or not, is between him and the Kodesh Baruch Hu, and therefore, nowhere do we find by mitzvah sichas kavona that there is a need for dibur. That's number 1. Number 2, Lishma is a gather of Yichud. Psul Kodshim is bitul Yichud. That necessitates dibur. Mitzvah sichas kavona is a chelik of avodas Elokim, and that does not necessitate dibur. To me, it's a Parshas. So what does the Noida Yehuda mean when he says mitzvahs shalanu kikod shemeim v'stam elishma? Why does he stress mitzvahs shalanu? So to me, it is very clear. The question of l'shem yichud is a very simple and a very fundamental one. We know and we believe, and we learn that primarily from the Mekabolim, that every mitzvah affects oilemis elyonim. So basically, mitzvahs are for us. This is what you need to do. Bedinu sheyitl sechoroi. But the Mekabolim taught us that mitzvahs affect oilemis. We don't even know what oilemis elyonim are. We don't know what they mean when they say Atzilus and Bria and Yitzira and Asiya. We don't know what the Esespheres are, but we know they exist. And we know that our mitzvahs, yes, change. They make a difference. They make a difference on our neshumas. They make a difference in Olam Eseliyonim. So the question is, all the kavanas, and all the tikkunim, and all the yechudim, does a person have to have them in mind, or it's all automatic? And as soon as a person is makayim a mitzvah l'shem shomayim, לא על מנת להתגדל ולא על מנת לקנטר ולא על מנת להתייהר, but he's makayim a mitzvah l'shem shomayim, that is all is required from his side, and all the rest happens on its own. That is the argument of the Noida B'Yehuda. There is no need for dibur. There's no even any need for kavanah. All you need to do is be mekayim a mitzvah l'shem shomayim, ma'av esoel, and all the rest is not up to you. All the rest will just fall into place. That is the argument of the Noida B'Yehuda, and that is what the Noida B'Yehuda means. Mitzvah shalonu. When we are mekayim a mitzvah l'shma, kikod shemei v'stoma l'shma, all the rest will happen without your input. So that is the way I understand the Noida B'Yehuda. And then the Shoyal had another argument, which is even more outrageous than the first, I must say. And I don't know why the Noida B'Yehuda took it seriously. So argument number 2 was, by Nedorim and Shavuos, there is a need for Bitui Sfusayim. So we see that Machshava means nothing, only Bitui Sfusayim. So if I would be the Noida B'Yehuda, I would say, well, what are you talking about? Ma inyan zeh etzel zeh. That is the din of Neder and Shavuot. There, the Torah says Bitui Sfusayim. Does that mean that Machshavas Elev is nil, is void? Of course Machshavas Elev is important. Truma is chal b'machshava. There is no need for dibur. And what about all the mitzvahs that are b'machshava? Avas ukeil and yiras ukeil and amunas yichud and what do you want to prove from Nedorim and Shavuot? But the Noida B'Yehuda, I don't know, answers l'shitose, and he says, yes. So the fact that we need Bitui Sfusayim and Nedorim and Shavuot proves that machshava into itself is not enough without a dibur. But Maisa should be enough without dibur. Why do we need a dibur when there's a Maisa? That is the second argument of the Noida B'Yehuda. So anyway, the Noida B'Yehuda goes into Lamdus. And he rejects the Minhag of l'shem Yichud. And the Be'er Mayim Chaim is miyasher. And as I made it clear, this has very, very early sources. So I wrote a letter a few years ago. Somebody asked me whether I say l'shem Yichud. What's my Minhag? And why did he ask me? Because in Agodah Shel Pesach Minchas Osho we find l'shem Yichud. So I could make my life easy and say, well, even the Mishnah Berurah brings l'shem Yichud b'Leila Seder. Agodah Shel Pesach is about Leila Seder. But I do say l'shem Yichud, and why? Why is that? Because to me it is clear. First of all, I quoted the early Kabbalah. What is not well known in the Litvische world is that I think the Gaon and his great Talmidim did say l'shem Yichud, even though it's not in Ma'aserav. There's a very substantial letter in Igros Chazanish. The Chazanish writes, even the Talmidei Gaon were not Boki in his Minhag, because they saw him once or twice a year. The Gra lived in seclusion. He wasn't a Rosh Yeshiva, he wasn't a Toifus Yeshiva, he was a Mizbaydei. And the Chazanish writes, even the Talmidim of the Gaon weren't Boki in his Minhagim, because they saw him rarely, maybe once or twice a year. So, obviously the Gaon didn't say out loud l'shem Yichud, because if he would, it would be in Ma'aserav. Ma'aserav is a very, very reliable source for Minhag HaGra. So in Ma'aserav we find not this and not that. But in Aderes Eliyahu, in Devorim, Parshas Aleph Posuk Vav, the Gaon explains the Kavanah in l'shem Yichud Kudish U'Bericho, the Yachad Shem Yud Kei B'Vav Kei. He explains it. And in Ori Yael, which is Talmidei HaGra, he writes that one should say Hineni Mechanim Mezuman. We explained before, Hineni Mechanim Mezuman is different than Hashem Yichud. That is also accepted by the Noida B'Yehuda and the Chayyim. Reb Chaim Volozhiner has his shitta about Torah Lishma. And that is a matter of discussion between Hasidim and Mismagdim, once again. So the Talmidim of the Baal Shem Tov, quoting his name, Torah Lishma means Torah L'Shem Shemayim, L'Shem HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So Reb Chaim Volozhiner asked, why don't we say Torah Lishma? We never refer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'Lashon Eikev. So why do we say Torah Lishma, not Torah Lishma Agadol? So according to the Baal Shem Tov, it's Torah L'Shem Shechina. Torah L'Shem Asheros HaShechina. That's why it's Lashon Eikev. So Reb Chaim twice. Nefesh HaChaim Shar Daled. Ruach Chaim, very beginning of Perek Vav, Masechet Avos. And the Mishnah Kol Oisek Torah Lishma Zoichel Dvarim Ha'ava. And Reb Chaim Volozhiner on these two sources explains what is Torah Lishma. And he says Torah L'Shem Torah. And then he goes on and he writes in Ruach Chaim, of course, before a person starts learning, he should be Maharav B'yiras Hashem. Because it needs to be your Osoi Kodemes L'Chochmosoi. So before you start learning, you should be Maharav and Dveikis and in Yiras Hashem. But once you start learning, it's Torah L'Shem Torah. And there's no need to interrupt your learning to be Maharav, B'Chasidus, U'B'Dveikis, U'B'Av, U'B'Yirah. That all is before learning. And if you had the proper approach and proper machshavas before learning, then whenever you learn is l'shem yichud kudish o barichu yishchintay. So this expression that Reb Chaim Volozhiner does indicate, he doesn't say one should say it. But he does say, if you had the proper preparation, and you were maharav ba'ava u'b'yira before learning, then memela, whatever you learn is l'shem yichud kudish o barichu. So to me it is clear that Reb Chaim Volozhiner, Gedol Talmidei Agro, had nothing against Yichud, as we also find in Ederes Eliyahu. The Nachlas David was one of the greatest Talmidim of Reb Chaim Volozhiner, and his Sefer on Bava Basra is very well known, Nachlas David. But there are droshes Nachlas David, Chelik Beis Drush Aleph, and he explains at great length what is the Kavona Liyachad Shem Yud Kei B'Vav Kei, explaining what is Yud Kei and what means Vav Kei, and that is one of the great Talmidim of Reb Chaim Volozhiner. So the Goen, the Talmidim definitely weren't part of the Hasidic movement. Yeah, that is that you all know. You know, the Grove is signed on a cherem against Hasidim. And nevertheless, as I just proved from the Goen, from Reb Chaim Volozhiner, from the Nachlas David, that L'Shem Yichud was part of their Avodas Ukeil. So I think the key is in Sulam Beis El, which is the introduction of Rabbi Yankov Emden to his very famous and renowned Siddur. Siddur Emden, Siddur Beis Yankov. And Rabbi Yankov Emden writes that his father, the great Chacham Tzvi, rejected saying L'Shem Yichud. He was against it. And that is one of the ridiculous things that the publishers of the Emden Siddur did. They published the Emden Siddur, and they put in all the L'Shem Yichuds, and they weren't aware that the Yankov Emden in his Akdama is against L'Shem Yichud. So how could you publish the Emden Siddur and put in all the L'Shem Yichuds? Which is totally ridiculous. This is supposed to be the Yankov Emden Siddur. So how do you put in stuff which in his Akdama he writes, I do not say, my great father did not say. So the Yankov Emden daven Nusach Ashkenaz, and the Emden Siddur is Nusach Sfarad. So the Pirushim are of Yankov Emden, but the Nusach has nothing to do with Yankov Emden, and nothing proves that more strongly than the fact L'Shem Yichud. I do see here the new edition of Yankov Emden, and we need to check on this one whether they took out the L'Shem Yichud, as they should have. If they didn't, once again it's a mistake. So anyway, so Rabbi Yankov Emden writes that my great father didn't say L'Shem Yichud. Why? Because L'Shem Yichud is Soidus Nizgovim and is Kodesh Kodeshim and the Kavonas Gvoyes V'Ram V'Nisa. And it's not Ra'ui that Hediotis, that don't even understand what they're saying, should say it. That is different than the Noidi B'Yehuda. The Noidi B'Yehuda says there's no need and it makes no sense. Rabbi Yankov Emden says that was made for the great Mekubalim that understood what they're saying. It's not for the Hamoin Am, and that's why my father didn't say. So that's different. So in my opinion, the only reason the Noida Yehuda was against L'Shem Yichud is the spirit of the times. It was not that many years after the tragedy of Shabsei Tzvi and Yaakov Frank. And the early Misnagdim were really afraid. And maybe their fright was justified at the time of a new movement with miracle workers, with Kabbalim, and many of the Rebbes were not the very well-known Gedolei Yisrael. And Gedolei Yisrael rejected the fact that Kabbalah once again comes to the forefront instead of Halacha, instead of Dikdei Kadin, instead of Asmodus HaTorah, a new movement based on Kabbalah, and that is why the Noida Yehuda is so adamantly against it. Times have changed. So when somebody printed a sefer about 10 years ago, and he wrote at great length about the Cherem against the Hasidim, many Hasidim were angry. I was just amused, not even angry, because I thought trying to revive the Cherem against Hasidim today is ridiculous, hilarious. It isn't even aggravating, it's just sheer stupidity. 300 years transpired, and the Baal Shem Tov wasn't Shabsei Tzvi. And Hasidim are around, Mekachem Shem Shemayim, as great as anyone else. And Hasidus historically was the only bastion against Haskalah and against all other movements. When Yiddishkeit was almost totally annihilated in Lithuania and in Germany and in Hungary, the only true bastion against Haskalah were the Hasidim in Poland and in Western Galicia, and those were the huge kehillas in which the Haskalah didn't find inroads. So after 300 years, yes, I mean, obviously, this movement proved itself more than any other movement in Jewish history, since the Mishnah, since the Nevi'im. So, in our day and age, there is no reason to reject saying L'Shem Yichud. And even if we don't really know exactly what it means, we do have explanations. The Nachlas David explains, the Vorim Misyashram Alaleiv. Chazal say Yud K and Vav K is Olam Habo and Olam Hazeh. And in our mitzvahs, we combine Ruchnis and Gashmis, Olam Habo and Olam Hazeh, the Guf and the Neshama, and that is Yud K and Vav K. Rabbi Yankiv Emden has his own explanation. But even if you don't understand what you're saying, there's nothing wrong in saying this tefillah. And what the Noida Yehuda was afraid of 250 years ago is no longer relevant today. And I think today the Noida Yehuda and Rabbi Yankiv Emden, nobody would have anything against saying L'Shem Yichud. So that is the Minhag of our Ovis, and I do say it.
About the hefsek they don't speak in the Yehuda, it's a hefsek between the brocha and the master mitzvah.
No, you definitely should say L'Shem Yichud before saying the brocha. Definitely not between the brocha and the mitzvah. Of course not.
Say in the Tilis matzah, and then L'Shem Yichud for the Achilas matzah. So there's a hefsek between the Tilis and...
No, it definitely would be no hefsek between the Tilis and the Suda. Tzorech Suda. There's no hefsek. But you don't say it after Birchas HaMitzvah or Birchas HaNa'anen. You always say it before Birchas HaMitzvah and Birchas HaNa'anen. So this is a very interesting discussion, and we also had a historical review. And what I say is the Chidah. And the Chidah in Sefer Simchas HaRegel brings the Noida Yehuda. And first, he writes a very interesting line. And he writes, "V'mechila mekoy terosa shel Noida Yehuda," and the Chidah is almost a contemporary of the Noida Yehuda. And he writes that the Noida Yehuda goes against Reb Shimon bar Yochai and the Ariya Kodesh and Eliyahu Hanavi. I don't know why. What does Eliyahu Hanavi have to do with it? I don't know. But the Chidah writes that the Noida Yehuda goes against Rashbi Why? All we find in Zohar is that a person should say Hineni Oisa, L'Shem Mitzvah, and the Noidi Buddha says the same. So why is the Noidi Buddha against Rash Be'arinov? Against Dari? Yes, because it's against the Shem Yichud, which has a source in Shah Ruach HaKodesh. Why it's against Eliyahu Novi? I have no idea. Unless Eliyahu Novi told the Chidah that he's angry at the Noidi Buddha. I don't know. So I don't know why the Chidah writes it's against Eliyahu Novi. And then the Chidah writes that I think the Noidi Buddha would agree that people that are steeped in Kabbalah should say L'Shem Yichud. So the Chidah, what Rav Yankov Emden quotes in the name of his father, the Chidah argues even the Noidi Buddha would agree to that. And therefore in our day and age, I don't think anybody would reject. You know, we say things we don't understand, but we ask a Kodesh Baruch Hu, Shiyeh Choshev Ki'ilu. Ki'ilu kivanti kol hakavona shekivnu anshe knesses agdoila, and our intention is liyachad shmoy shel HaKodesh Baruch Hu b'yolamai, and liyachad shem yud kei vavavkei, and there's nothing wrong with saying it in our day and age. Kach nera boro ulani yazdai. So today we discussed an interesting topic, which, as I explained, has some connection with the first pasuk in the weekly parsha. Vayu Eikev tishmon. Mitzvah shodem dash Eikev. The routine. We need to be mekadesh our routine, because ultimately what makes you an Oved Elokim, and what brings you closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is not kol nidrei. It's not your matzah and your moror. It's not the mitzvahs that we're makayim once a year. Everybody could rise to the challenge. It is what you do with your Seder Hayom. How close is your routine to HaKadosh Baruch Hu? And that is the importance of the mitzvahs. Sha'adam dash va'akevav u'shemartem va'asisa ma'isam aloshen ovev shomer asadaro. So I want to share with you a thought which I recently thought about, and I was very moved, and I think efshar that it's an emes. So one of the mitzvahs we have in this week's parsha is the mitzvah of Berchos Hamazon. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu promises to bring us into the land of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, the promised land that HaKadosh Baruch Hu promised to our forefathers. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, when you will be Zaychot, the Eretz Chita V'Sorah V'Gefen V'Teine V'Rimam, Eretz Zeis, Shem and Dvash. And the Torah speaks about Shivcho Shel Eretz Yisrael. V'Yochalta V'Savoto V'Rachtu Hashem Elokecha L'Oretz Atovu Asher Nosan Lach. So in Brachas Chofam mit Beis, the Gemara says, Shalu Malachi Ashoras is HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Ato Omarto, Asher Lo Yisaponim V'Lo Yikach Shoichad. Kadosh Baruch Hu is not Noisaponim. V'ato Noisaponim L'Yisrael Shenema Yisrael Hashem Ponim V'Lecha V'Yosem L'Cho Sholem. So the angels asked HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you said in your Torah, Hukei HaGodel, Asher Lo Yisaponim V'Lo Yikach Shoichad. But that contradicts Berchas Koyanim. Yisro Hashem Ponav Alecha. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu responded, V'chi eich loy esor lehem ponav liyisrael, shani umarti v'ochalto v'savoto v'rachto Hashem Elokecho, v'hem machmirim al atzmam ad kezayis v'et kebeitza. I said there's no need to say Berchas Hamazon, only if you eat Kedei Svir. And they're machmer, even kezayis and even kebeitza. So they're machmer more than I demanded, and that is why Aninoisa Lohem Poni. So there are various interesting interpretations. The Goin in Mishlei on the Posek, Toiv Ayin Hu Yavorech Kinosam Alach Meladao. There's some Soifer Tshuvas Archaim Kuf Mem. But all these Pirushim are B'derech Drash. And I think my Pshat is B'derech Pshat. And it's an unbelievable Pshat. So why do Chazal say HaKadosh Baruch Hu is nice upon him? Because after this Chumrah, there are hundreds of mitzvahs that are bonim that go above and beyond the Chi of Diuraisa. So why doesn't the HaKadosh Baruch Hu mention any of them? Even Berchas Hamazon. Ani Omarti, V'chalto V'savoto V'rachto, V'hem machmirim al atzmam Daled Brochas, Gimel Brochas, Daled Brochas. Minhag, we merely have to say one bracha. Ani omarti v'ovadatu Hashem Elokecha. Minhag, we're yaitzu with one tefillah. And they daven 3 tefillahs a day, Shachas, Mincha, and Marav. I said, v'dibartu b'am kriya Shema. According to most of the Shoinim, we're yaitzu with Posek Rishon. And they say, Gimel Parshas. There's so many examples. So many examples. All the Derabbanans. So why does the Kodesh Baruch Hu emphasize Dafka the Chumrah of Berchas HaMazon? So my feeling is this. The psukim we just read, V'chaltu v'savatu, it's not only a mitzvah, it's a promise. Kodesh Baruch Hu's promises. Ki Hashem Elokecha meviyachu al eretz tov, eretz nachlei mayim, ayonas v'tohaimos, eretz chitu v'sa'ero, eretz asher lo b'meskenes toichu v'alechem, lo yitechsa kol ba, v'yochaltu v'savatu v'varachtu. I promised my children that once you will come into the promised land, you will live a life of abundance, a life of plenty. And this is a land in which there will be no lack and no need. Loi sechsar kol ba. And sometimes they don't even have kedei svia. Sometimes all I provide for them is ad kezayis v'ad kebeitz. And what do? They don't come to complain. They thank me and they express their gratitude. So we are noig with HaKadosh Baruch Hu lefnei Meshur Sadim. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells the Malachim, Hem nos'im li ponim, eich ani lo esa lehem ponim. It's not a chumrah. There are so many chumras. All the Rabbanans are chumras. Chazal don't mean, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu didn't mean, oh, they're machmer. There are hundreds of chumras. This is no different than the chumras in Dinei Tefillah, and Dinei Kriya Shema, Berchas HaMazon, and Me'ah Brochas B'Kol Yom. That's not the point. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, Hem nosim li ponim. I promised them. Eretz Zavas Chola V'Dvash, Eretz Chita V'Sa'ero, Loi Techsa Kol V'Ochalto V'Savoto U'Virakto, and you will come to Eretz Yisrael, and you will lack nothing. And many times they don't have kedei svia, and they barely have a kezayis or a kebeitzer, and they still come together and praise and give thanks and gratitude, and they say the same brachas that are required when you eat kedei svia, and they say the same even if they have a kezayis. Hem nosim li ponim, midike meged mida, I have to be nice upon him. So that would be my understanding in the Gemara, in Brochas, Daf Chaf, Beis. So that is what Avodas Hashem is all about. And that is our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, our love of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and His love to us. So, yes, we don't complain. So we would have the right to say to Boinei Shalom, this is not what you promised us. You promised. We endured. We endured 400 years of Mitzrayim. We endured Gudas, waiting to come to Eretz Yisrael. This is not what you promised us. But we don't complain. We're happy with whatever HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives us. And we sing the song of His praise and the song of gratitude. And that is how we're Zoiches. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, Yisu Hashem ponav alecha, v'yosem lecha shol. So Yirosem, we should always be Zoicha to thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu for whatever He gives us, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu should give, v'yachza v'yitan, and we should Zoicha b'kora b'yameinu. So this week we read the first Parsha of Parshas Anachoma, of Shivid Anachemto, Nachamu Nachmu, Ami Yomer Elokechem, Dabru Alevi Yerushalayim. So we should be Zoicha le'esnachem b'kiflayim, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu should send us Moshiach Tzidkenu b'mheru v'yomeinu Amen.